Chapter 7. Down to Business. The business of a gang like the Bloody Eye was hardly anything professional, but it was a business. They had expenses and incomes. They didn't have taxes, but they were part of a larger crime syndicate and had dues to pay. There were some authority figures still present in the tattered remains of the government, and they were all extremely dirty and each needed their own palms greased regularly. The hardest part of trying to figure out the finances of the gang were ascertaining the value of the things they obtained. The globalist credit currency had been nearly completely devalued in the Jonah collapse. Just like Jonah Freeman had predicted, once the confidence level slipped low enough, it would all become effectively worthless. But the things those credits would have bought weren't worthless. Everything had value, some more than others. Quantifying that value in a barter society was a monumental task. Jim had to break it down to assume credit value, inflate it and deflate it based on demand. Well, this might have broken a lesser accountant. Not Jim. Unlike everything else in the last few years, this was a challenge he could actually overcome. It took him dozens of hours, but eventually had a current value chart for everything the gang sold and bartered, as well as for the services they rendered. It was a little weird to call protection money a service rendered, but Jim did the best he could to roll with it. On the expenses side, a big one was fuel and batteries that powered the gang's big trucks. Companies still manufactured things after the Jonah collapse, but the rate at which they traded them for varied widely. A gallon of fuel could cost as little as a candy bar or as much as 5 goats. It was the Wild West of finances, just as it was the Wild West of crime and murder. But still, Jim could see ways to make their barter system infinitely more profitable. While the truck fuel, food, weapons, and ammunition of the gang all seemed important to their operation, the large amount they spent on hair dye and clothing was just absurd. The colorful style that helped make the Bloody Eye a feared gang also drained their budget to frightening lengths. Jim could understand the value of advertising, but this was near financial suicide. It was only AZ's terrifying personality that seemed to magically allow the gang not to instantly go broke in the process. Jim had, as tactfully as possible, suggested to AZ to dial back the style a bit, but all this earned him was another blow to his brain case. Failing that, Jim noticed the gang was vastly undervaluing the clothing smuggling racket they had been running. High-quality leather shoes in particular, from the one company that still made them, were worth a fortune, yet the gang's stranglehold on the import was treated as a minor afterthought. By redoubling their efforts and hiking up the price, turned out to be more valuable than all the other hustles the gang had combined. This made AZ happy, but not satisfied. As Jim had thought, while more wealth is good, peace of mind is better. Tracking down any thieves in AZ's gang is what he really wanted. Because of the varied value of items, tracking any theft was hard, if not impossible. Patterns did emerge over time, though. AZ's paranoia was not completely unfounded. A string of poor sales in both drugs and fresh fruit indicated that someone was carefully embezzling a steady stream of items from the gang. Which member of the gang that was, though, was difficult to track down, as the gang's internal operations were very fluid and not well tracked. When AZ wanted something done, unless he pointed to somebody in particular, the order would get passed down the ranks, and eventually someone would get stuck doing it. It would have been easy to track if the gang kept any sort of paper trail, but the very idea was laughable to AZ. Living conditions improved over time for both Nate and Jim, as Jim showed his worth to AZ. After a few successful suggestions to increase the gang's income, AZ added a cot to Jim's simulation and toned down Charlie's constant attacks. The Sharkman went from voracious to merely curious. Jim still wouldn't put his hand outside the cage, but Charlie no longer assaulted the bars regularly. This allowed Jim to finally sleep regularly, which increased his value to the gang, but also allowed him a little more time to think of some means of escape. Jim was absolutely certain AZ was well aware of his intentions, because he kept Nate very busy when he wasn't working directly on Jim's needs. As for Nate's well-being, it seemed to go from unbelievably bad to manageably horrible. Nate was getting a lot less cuts and bruises every day, and to their minor credit, the gang kept him fed. He was actually eating more in the gang's care than on his own. The daily ration of bread from the mission was nothing compared to the gang's meals. An army marches on its stomach, and AZ made certain his gang was well fed. This extended down to even the lowest ranking member. They even had antibiotics and bandages, which kept Nate's wounded hand from becoming infected. From what Jim learned from Nate, the large black guy with the green mohawk seemed to run things when AZ didn't care enough to bother. His name was Frankie, yes, with an I, and he had protected Nate to some small measure from the gang's vicious abuse. The reason for this, though, seemed to have more to do with keeping the gang members in line than any special interest in the boys' welfare. Since the night Jim had inadvertently suggested escaping in front of AZ, neither him nor Nate said much openly. Fortunately, being a clever kid, Nate found a way to speak directly in secret. Nate established a back door into Jim's virtual computer that allowed Jim to type messages from the virtual world and have them appear on Nate's screen in the real world. It looked like both of them were hard at work without any indication indication in the least that they were passing messages back and forth. To help spur on this ruse, Jim would occasionally ask Nate for something unimportant out loud. If they said nothing at all, Jim was certain AZ would catch on. Maybe his cronies were easy to fool, but it would be hard to get much past that red-headed madman. Through this information conduit, Jim learned that the gang was operating from a derelict oil tanker that had been dry docked before the Jonah collapse. Jim also learned the names of many of the gang members, as well as the work Nate did for them. Initially, they had Nate scrubbing toilets and washing clothes, but once they learned he could fix their many electrical and computer problems, he had taken on a whole new value to the gang. Jim also learned that AZ had taken a special interest in other neural encasements. AZ's new pet project set about pulling out every neural encasement he could find in the old New U building. Jim didn't much like the idea of his fellow head boys waking up as slaves to a sadistic gang leader, but it seemed better than a slow death in limbo. At least, if they were alive, they'd have a chance for rescue. AZ said nothing to Jim about it directly during Jim's many regular briefings with AZ, and Nate informed Jim that the work was supposed to be in secret. Jim was careful not to let on that he had any knowledge of it, but since learning of AZ's search, Jim eagerly asked Nate every time he could. At this time, Nate and some of the gang members pulled out dozens of neural encasements from the server farm, but all of them had been failures. Out of 126 encasements they found in those 2 weeks, most were fire damaged. A few that had survived the fire were cracked or crushed by the collapsed building. All it took was a single crack in the case to end a life. Jim himself might not have survived had he not been perfectly aligned with a surviving support beam. "Did you find any living brains today?" typed Jim into a side window of his accounting program before quickly switching back to his software to continue his work on the gang's finances. A minute went by without any response, but Jim knew better than to push the matter. Nate adjusted something inside a small black box with a screwdriver before hooking it up to a cable on the outside of his laptop case. After typing for a minute, a response appeared on Jim's virtual screen. 2 found alive. No response. Coma? The response was short, but that was to be expected. Jim had a lot more time to type out of sight than Nate. For a moment, a small smirk started to appear on Jim's face, but he fought it back as quickly as he could. Instead, he said aloud, "What these guys waste on hair dye could keep their trucks and fuel for a year." "Yeah," replied Nate with a smile. "Get back to work, ladies," echoed in an annoying female voice from outside of Jim's limited field of vision. Jim could guess the voice belonged to Diane. She was a pigtail-wearing blonde with black lipstick and a love for showing off her ample cleavage. She also had a crazy personality and no lack of hatred for little boys. She often got stuck watching Nate as he worked. Perhaps AZ felt that her distaste for weak males would ensure she'd keep them in line, or maybe just liked to watch her torture them for fun. Either way, Frankie would eventually stop her if her antics got in the way of Nate and Jim's jobs. Unfortunately, he wasn't around very much. If Diane was left alone by Frankie long enough, she'd rush in and tackle Nate, pinning him down for an impromptu makeup session. She'd delight in painting his face to the point he looked like a female clown. She once almost broke Nate's arm trying to get Nate to kiss Jim's screen. Nate said Frankie found out and gave her a black eye. Frankie didn't like her distracting Jim from doing his work. Jim waited a moment, then shot back another text to Nate. "What next? Can they be saved?" Nate continued to type, undistracted by Jim's response. Patiently, Nate waited a few minutes before responding. "Black fluid. Cleaning now. Waiting voice response. Hopeful." Jim was so happy by the news that he wanted to jump up and celebrate, but he calmly kept his normal scowl. It was then he looked to his right to see Charlie staring back at him with his cold, unblinking eyes. Instantly, panic set in. Jim knew this meant the software was taking notice of his emotional response. Whoever originally coded the shark used it to scare game players when their attention was distracted. The absolute last thing Jim wanted was this fake shark man to do something that might get AZ's attention and expose his clandestine communications with Nate. Jim focused on how much he hated the gang. As he did, he could feel his emotions slip away from happiness and relief and back towards anger and depression. The shark tilted its head like a confused dog for a moment, and then wandered off to continue its pacing. One of these days, Jim thought, "I'm gonna kill that shark."